If people want to wear a mask, that is okay. It protects others more than it protects you because it prevents you from breathing or speaking moistly on them. Oh, what a terrible image. Moistly. Moist. Oh, what a terrible image. Moistly. Moist. Oh, what a terrible image.
I'll do my best this episode to not speak moistly into the microphone. What's up, everybody? I'm your host, Kiefer, aka Budrino. This week, I'm going to be talking about how different provinces in Canada have handled the COVID situation, what the different projections mean between provinces, and just overall, why are certain provinces doing so well, and why are certain provinces struggling more than others. So to start off, first thing I want to mention is when we're looking at this, there's a lot of factors that are contributing into why certain outcomes are happening. So when we look at a public health issue in a country like Canada, we have to keep in mind the different levels of government, right? Like federal, provincial, municipal. And we also have to keep in mind corporations and employers, because they have, essentially, they actually have pretty much just as much power as the government with regard to some things, especially larger corporations like Amazon, Walmart, Loblaws. Those large corporations, they have a huge impact on public policy, and their corporate policy for employees are just as important as what the government's telling them to do, because these companies don't actually really have to do what the government tells them, or they haven't been doing what they're supposed to, at least with social distancing and stuff like that. I'll also apologize, my nose is really stuffy, so hopefully it's not too fucking annoying when I'm sniffling my way through this episode. But the other thing we have to factor in too is that healthcare is a provincial problem. It's mostly under provincial jurisdiction. When we look at comparing Canada's cases to other countries, usually it's more effective to compare provinces to other countries, especially smaller countries, because Canada as a whole, certain provinces have like next to no cases and other provinces have thousands. So it is pretty complicated with regard to that. And when we're looking at evaluating how a province has responded, we have to keep in mind that there's a ton of different kind of factors that contribute to how certain outcomes have happened. And we also have to keep in mind when we're analyzing this kind of stuff that, you know, testing rates, when we're looking at testing rates, you can't just look at testing rates itself. You also have to keep in mind how quickly the tests have been done, right? Because when you're looking at the testing rates for a country like South Korea, one of the reasons it was so effective is they did a lot of testing very quickly. And even though now, you know, when we're looking, I saw a certain news station, I don't remember which one, but they were talking about, you know, the amount of cases and tests done and comparing different countries to South Korea. But the thing is that South Korea has managed their peak. They don't need to be doing a large amount of testing because they did a lot of testing very quickly, and they did a lot of contract tracing very quickly, which resulted in, you know, a very steep flattening of their curve. They did a very good job at bringing it down. And now they don't have a need to be doing millions of tests because the country has mostly controlled the problem. Whereas other countries with higher, like just way more cases in general and way more cases per population, per 100,000 people, it's a completely different situation. You need much more tests. So when I see people saying, oh, we're doing a better job than South Korea, well, Canada has long surpassed South Korea as a country in terms of cases and deaths. I think South Korea only had around like 8,000 or 10,000 cases. Canada's way, way, way above that. So obviously we need to adjust for that and make sure that we understand that, because that's one of the biggest problems with this, is that this is really unprecedented. A lot of people in the media and stuff like that, when we're analyzing this stuff, there's a lot of things to learn. And unfortunately, when you're analyzing this stuff, you really have to keep in mind the different factors that contribute to this kind of things, because you can't compare Canada's test rates to South Korea's right now because South Korea has done a much better job at flattening the curve. Now you can compare provinces because that's a little bit different, but it's really important to keep in mind that kind of stuff because I see certain news stations when they're talking about certain statistics and stuff like that, it gets really confusing very quickly, and it also gets very misleading very quickly. You have to, when you're comparing these kind of things, you have to compare it on a level playing field, and you have to understand what those numbers actually mean. So that's what I'm going to try and do this episode. Obviously, like I said, I'm not an expert, but I have done my best to read a ton of academic articles recently, and I don't even know how many I've read in the last couple of weeks. But I do feel like I have learned a lot of stuff, and my goal is to pass on what I've learned to other people. So when it comes to the provinces, I'll start off with talking about BC, and I'll move my way eastward across the country. I'm only going to talk about provinces with like major outbreaks, because smaller provinces like Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Newfoundland, they haven't had the same level of outbreaks as other provinces, and that's due to a bunch of other factors. And then the other thing too is a lot of provinces have kind of had similar stances towards doing this. So if I talked about every single province, it would just take forever. So sorry, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Newfoundland, other eastern provinces and territories. I'll most likely talk about those in the future once there's more data to talk about. So starting off with BC, I'll first off say that obviously I'm open about my biases and stuff like that, and in the past I've supported the NDP. But when it comes to provincial governments, I'm critical of basically all of them in Canada. I don't even when it came to the NDP with Rachel Notley, I was very critical of her. I'm still critical of a lot of things with BC's government, with Horgan. So when it comes to BC, I'm definitely not giving them favoritism, because I actually have a lot of issues with the way Horgan's handled some other things prior to this. So that being said, though, so far, BC has had the most success at flattening the curve. And getting to why that happened is kind of complicated because, like I said, there's so many factors with what we're dealing with here. And we're also dealing with a disease that is really quite unprecedented in modern human history in terms of just how infectious it is and how we're dealing with it. So as we go as a society, we're constantly learning more about it. And that's why it's really important that when we look at academic studies, we think about them critically, right? Because, before this all started, you always hear on the radio, oh, here's a study from here, here's a study from there. And a lot of the times those studies are not peer reviewed and stuff like that. And, it's really important right now because there's so many new studies coming out about COVID and the way to handle it and stuff like that, that you have to think about it not only critically, but you also have to look at who peer reviewed it, right? Like when someone publishes a study, that's usually a person or a team, they publish an academic paper, and usually you have a lot of time to have your peers in the field review it, and it's basically other people with doctorates in the field will review that study, they'll say their criticisms, and once it's peer reviewed, then it's usually published in a journal it varies by field, but that's basically the general idea. And what's important here, though, is when we're looking at studies to do with COVID, we have to keep in mind that a lot of people aren't peer reviewing them because this stuff is just so new, right? Like I saw a study, I think it was a theory more so actually from an Italian doctor about putting too many people on ventilators too early can damage their alveoli, in their lungs and stuff like that. And when I read it, I'm like, oh, okay, this kind of makes sense. But then I further read that it hadn't really been peer reviewed, and another person with a doctorate said it was basically a theory at this point. So this is why overall it's really important to keep in mind that a lot of the information we're talking about changes rapidly, and a lot of it's not set in stone. Stuff is going to change, opinions are going to change, theories will change, and over time hopefully it will get better as there's more studies done. And once there's more cases too, it's easier to do more studies and different types of analysis and stuff like that. So connecting that back to BC, it's really hard to actually say why BC has done so well, because in terms of provinces in Canada, we've had varying degrees of response. But at the core, most provinces are pretty similar with the way they handled it. There's no giant outliers. Kind of like in the States, there's some huge outliers, right? Certain states have handled it very differently than other states. In Canada, there's kind of been more of like a uniform response. So with BC, though, that's what kind of makes it hard to say is I read that they did a pretty good job of testing early, not the best, but better than some of the other provinces. And I've also read some theories that some people think BC, the curve, they were able to flatten it because a lot of people listened. Now, I know some people in BC, and fucking like every person I've seen in BC has just been going to the beach and like partying, and like I've just seen all these people going out and stuff like that. So it you know, from my perspective, I was like, how the hell is BC doing that? But then again, that's obviously a select number of people and stuff. But overall, it also looks like there's other contributing factors too, like international travel. BC had a different March break than the other provinces, so that could have also contributed to it. But overall, the province has actually done a very good job at lowering the amount of cases, and they haven't had the types of outbreaks that Ontario and Quebec has had. So far, BC has done the best. It's obviously there's factors of chance and just like how much people listen to their government and stuff like that. That's another important thing too here is that the government is not the end all be all. The government proposes a strategy, but it's up to the people, the corporations, the employers to react to that kind of stuff. So it's kind of hard to just, you can blame a government for having very bad policy. If it's really bad, you'll see immediate impacts, but it's harder to say when everyone's kind of handling it a certain way. But I did look at BC. A couple things I did like about what they did is I saw that they had some hydro credits that varied from other, because most provinces have banned evictions and taken some steps towards reducing the impact of this. But I did like how BC was giving certain credits and deferrals for hydro, like electricity payments, and also I saw that they were giving, I think it was $225 per child for families with special needs per month. So I like those two things. I saw that BC did differently. The BC Health Department, like every province has their own public health website, and I looked at this is where I got all my information from every province's public health website. And with BC, I liked theirs. I didn't think it was the best, but I do think that they did. It was pretty clear at the way they presented information. I'll go into that with the next province about which province had presented the information best. But overall, the thing to take from BC is that they've flattened their curve to be most like South Korea. The province has done a very good job. They have done enough tests that the case rates connect to the test. So one of the issues is that if you don't do enough tests, you can say, oh, well, our cases are lowering. But if you're not doing enough tests, then that doesn't actually reflect what's happening. But with BC, the hospitalizations, the ICU, the people in intensive care has lowered. And that combined with the lowering of case rates and the high amount of testing, it is pretty safe to say that BC has flattened the curve. But one thing I will say about flattening the curve is that it's a long-term game. It's not this singular curve. When this first started and I first started seeing academic information and people communicating about this publicly, we keep talking about the curve as if it's this one singular curve. But it's not, because this problem is going to be a problem that is most likely going to be with us for at least a year and a half, maybe 2 years, or maybe more. It's not going to be one curve. There's going to be multiple curves, and it's pretty likely that that's going to happen. Even if we do an extremely good job, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that come next fall, there will be another curve. So when we're looking at this, I think it's really, really important to keep in mind that there will be multiple curves. Just because we did a good job with this first one does not mean that there will not be another one that's worse. And I think that's really important to note, because I don't think enough people are talking about that. That I've seen a lot of responses from people who kind of seem to think that, we'll be able to flatten the curve and then it's just done and we can go back to life as normal. But from all the academic information I've looked at, that's not really going to happen. At least, well, when I say normal, I mean, okay, we're not going to be locked in our homes for 2 years, but, things like sporting events and our life is going to be changed to some degree for a couple of years because of this, most likely, unless we find a way to just completely stop it. And even then, you still need preventative measures to stop it from coming back into the country. This is a long-term problem. It's not a short-term problem with a short-term solution. This is a long-term problem that needs a long-term solution to properly beat this. So the next province I want to talk... Oh, I forgot to mention, BC has a population of like 5 million people, and that's important because Alberta has a population of like around 4.5 million people, and comparing BC and Alberta is easier because they have similar populations. Now, when you compare BC, Alberta to Ontario and Quebec, you kind of have to adjust for population in the models and case rates and stuff like that because there's a significant population difference between those provinces. But Alberta hasn't flattened the curve as well as BC has, but it does look like they've flattened. Well, they're starting to flatten the curve. It's hard to say with Alberta because some of their data was like kind of not the website, but like their case rates were kind of inconsistent for a bit, so it's kind of hard to tell where they're at. But Alberta's kind of looks like it'll be somewhere between. It'll maybe be as good as BC, and it won't be as bad as Ontario and Quebec in this first wave. Now, Alberta has done the highest testing per capita and involved other things like with contact tracing. They've done all of that in Canada, and they've also been pretty successful at doing that worldwide. I'm just bringing up the information here. Alberta's done, I don't know if it's like the most tests per capita because it's hard to say because you also have to factor in Alberta only has 4.4 million people, so it's easier for them to do a lot of tests compared to a place like Ontario that has like 3 times as many people. But Alberta has, I'm looking right here at the tests per 100,000 population. Alberta's done a better job than South Korea, Australia, Italy, everywhere. Alberta's done a very, very good job so far at testing, doing contact tracing, just taking it seriously. So far, the hardest hit area is in Calgary, which makes sense because we're seeing this disease break out the most in urban centers with a lot of people coming in and out. Places like Toronto, Montreal, that's a lot of first places we saw at least. My area around Ottawa is actually a little bit of an exception because we have seen a spike in some of the cases outside in the rural areas, but that's also linked to the seniors' homes and long-term care homes. But so talking about how Alberta has handled it, Jason Kenney, the premier, was like, it's complicated, but he's had issues with doctors, and like him and doctors have been at each other for a while before this all started, and he's even had examples of doctors wanting to leave the province because of certain policies he had from before. So that's definitely not a good thing when you're in the middle of a pandemic and your doctors are really, really pissed at you. But I will say Alberta does do a very good job at presenting their information. Alberta and Quebec have the best websites. I like their information the most. Quebec has a ton of different information of like by population. Same thing with Alberta. It shows you like who's like the fatality rates for certain age groups, the case rates and hospitalization rates for certain age groups. I will say that Alberta, I do really like their website. It's very clear. You just type in Alberta Public Health and a ton of information comes up in a slideshow and tables. It's very clear. It's communicated very well and very effectively to the point where I think that an average everyday person can look at it and get a really good understanding very quickly and not feel confused. And I think that's really fantastic. I think that's really important because communication is a huge issue during a pandemic like this because getting the message out about what's happening and stuff like that, it's not easy. And especially to people who are older, who don't have access to the internet, it's really hard to get that information out to them. The only really medium they use, especially for very older people, is television usually. And getting that information out to them about what they should do, what should happen, is difficult. And I do think that since Alberta made it so easy to go on the website and see the stuff, it's very user friendly. It's kind of like a video game. There are good video games, but a lot of the best ones I like are very user friendly. You can do stuff very quickly and figure out what you want, get that information fast. And that's where I'll criticize Ontario's public health website later, is it's not as clear. The information isn't right there. It's more difficult to access. It's not as detailed too. And another thing I really liked about Alberta, their health website, is that they talked about the comparison of the different scenarios. So I got the graph right here, and they basically break it down very effectively. They show you basically 3 different scenarios of what could happen: the extreme outcomes, the elevated, kind of like normal outcomes, and then like the more best case scenario situation. So what I like about that is, so for example, here it shows for the extreme outcome. So that's kind of a worst case scenario. That's kind of if social distancing measures are not taken properly, people aren't doing it and not listening. It shows that by kind of like mid-April, you could have a peak amount of 1.6 million total infections, resulting in between 16,000 and 32,000 total deaths throughout this kind of first wave. Because that's not including what would happen in the fall, but we don't know what's going to happen in the fall yet. But so that's kind of the worst case scenario with Alberta, which it doesn't look like they're on the path to that right now. The middle, kind of not the best case, but not the worst case scenario, they called it elevated, is an early May peak of total infections with about 1 million people infected, and anywhere between 500 and 6,600 people could die. And then lastly, it shows the kind of more so best case probable scenario based on their current peak, hopefully, that they would have more so of a mid-May peak with only 800,000 total infections, with somewhere between 400 to 3,100 deaths. So what's nice about that is they really break it down too. They even show you the hospitalizations with the different elevated scenarios. So if we look at the elevated scenario, the mid-tier one, you could see at the peak 1,600 people hospitalized. Whereas the better case scenario one, it says about 800 people could be hospitalized at the peak of the curve, which is really useful because then you can see, okay, well, what's the healthcare capacity? And that's what they show you right next. They show you the ICU beds, the hospital beds, and it kind of confirms that if there is a large outbreak, we will not have the capacity to deal with an extremely large outbreak. We have to keep it lower in order for those people to receive care and not just be left to die, because our healthcare system doesn't have that capacity after 40 years of healthcare cuts to our healthcare system, unfortunately. But like I said, Alberta seems to be on a decent path. It is kind of hard to say right now at the time I'm doing this. BC for sure has flattened the curve. Alberta's, I've seen different estimates and different opinions from different people, so it'll likely more so be confirmed within the next week or so of what's happening. But things do look pretty optimistic for Alberta. Things look pretty optimistic as a whole countrywide, with the exception of long-term care homes, because that is a massive problem right now in Canada. And that brings me to our next province, the province of Ontario, that has a current population of around 14.5 million people. Ontario hasn't been able to flatten the curve the way BC, Alberta, and certain other provinces have had so far. Ontario has had some really bad problems with breakouts and long-term care homes, as well as Ontario is it's hard to compare those provinces because obviously there's a lot more people coming in and out of Ontario, so it's Ontario is going to have more cases most likely than a province. Like even if you adjust for population, Ontario is going to have more cases per 100,000 people than a province like Manitoba, because you have Toronto, you have Ottawa, you have international airports. In Ontario, you have a lot of people, kind of a transient population going in and out of the province for business, for all kinds of things. That contributes to why it's, Ontario is going to be different than a province like Manitoba. But that being said, Ontario has problems, and a lot of them connect back to problems that happened before this. Now, I talked about it last episode. Obviously, I'm not a fan of Doug Ford, but I do think he has handled this problem better than I was expecting. Like I said before, when he told people during March break to go have fun, I was like, oh no, fuck, like this is going to be really bad. But since then, he has shown a huge improvement from saying that stuff to kind of just making better decisions, better strategies. He did ban evictions earlier than a province like BC, which I like that. That was good. Now, there's other issues and other criticisms I have of Doug Ford, obviously, that connect back to stuff that happened before this, because this is where the big problem happens is, the shortage of personal protection equipment goes back to a problem that happened before this, where Ontario had a bunch of masks from the last SARS outbreak, and we destroyed over 50 million masks because we said that they expired. I think this happened last year. And we destroyed them because the elastic bands over time are supposed to kind of dry off. Obviously, that was a really bad decision because we were in desperate, dire need of N95 masks, and there's a massive shortage. Now, even if we took those masks and put different rubber elastic bands on them, if that was a problem, because I saw, from what I saw at least, the information, the masks themselves don't expire. It's the elastic bands that can break and not give you a proper seal. So even if you took them and put a different elastic band on them, those masks could have been really useful. Now, I will say that, destroying those masks, it would have been really hard, like a year ago and whatever, to understand that, we're going to have the worst pandemic happening a year from now. But those masks should have been replaced. Having a healthy, prosperous healthcare system is the number one way to stop problems like this from getting bigger. And that mask problem connects to other problems with Doug Ford, with specific things like long-term care problems, because this is a problem across all of Canada, but Ontario and Quebec are experiencing some really bad. Most of the deaths are in Ontario and Quebec are in long-term care centers, and a lot of that connects to, in Ontario, the privatization of these businesses. Now, if anyone has the unfortunate experience of knowing someone who's older and has died, and had a cancer or something like that, you'll know that it sucks. Ontario, if you go to a long-term care home, those places they look like fucking prisons. They are brutal. There's abuse, and there's so many problems. It's such a sad way that we treat our elderly. Kind of in this culture, this Western culture of the United States and Canada, we really don't give a fuck about old people. If you look at different cultures across the world, it's interesting how certain people will kind of prioritize their elderly populations. They won't treat them as shitty as we do. I know for a fact that my ancestry traces back to Europe. And I know for a fact that in certain Eastern European cultures, they take care of their grandparents. They'll have their grandparents live in their home with them if they're old and sick, and they'll make sure that they have a really high standard of living. Whereas here, you see these long-term care homes, and it's just brutal. And, there's a lot of people who just would rather die than go to some of them because they really are brutal. And if you don't believe me, go to one. But this connects to Doug Ford because not only Doug Ford, also the Liberals, that there was a huge scandal that was kind of talked about recently, that a lot of the inspections for these older long-term care centers, Doug Ford cut them. They stopped happening. The government stopped doing inspections at a lot of these places, which allowed them to develop patterns and problems that is now directly contributing to higher amounts of deaths in Ontario in these areas because they're not taking the proper protocols. These places are understaffed. There's systemic issues in the way they're ran. These places have big problems. And the other thing that frustrates me about this is when people who are liberals come out and say, oh, yeah, it's Doug Ford, it's Doug Ford. But the liberals were in power for like 15 years before Doug Ford. This is also their problem. I really hate that when people who are centrists and are liberals criticize conservatives for things that are also their problem. Like, liberals spend more time in power than conservatives do in Canada. You know, liberals are kind of the natural governing party in Canada. Conservatives only really get, in certain areas of Canada, they get power, but in many other areas of Canada, it kind of has to be a perfect storm for a conservative party to gain power, right? Like, Harper kind of had to, capitalize off of the Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien corruption and problems like that to get elected. When you look at other conservative leaders like Brian Mulroney, him coming to power, he kind of, when he beat John Turner, the liberal, and when he also beat like other people, it was a complicated problem. So it really frustrates me when liberals criticize conservatives when they're a part of the problem themselves. And I see that, even from certain like healthcare workers I've seen who support the liberals. But it's like, if you're a healthcare worker, I don't understand why you support the liberals, because they make cuts to the healthcare system just like the conservatives do. So to me, it doesn't make sense when these people, they hate the conservatives so much, but when it comes to the liberals making cuts, they're like, not a big deal. And the liberals didn't address this problem either in the long-term care centers. And if you want to read, there's a pretty good article by Nora Loretto in this publication called Passage. I'll link it on when I tweet this out, and I put it on different platforms. But that kind of goes into why these long-term care centers are experiencing these outbreaks and what the other problems are that connect back to not only Doug Ford, but to Kathleen Wynne, to Dalton McGuinty, and to Mike Harris. This problem goes back a long time of privatizing these long-term care centers and putting profits before people. And there's numerous examples of some really disturbing stuff happening at these places, and people just don't really care. And it's unfortunate, because this is why it's happening, right? COVID it's fundamentally exposing holes in our system. It's fundamentally exposing problems in our infrastructure of how we're not able to deal with things. And right now, I knew beforehand that long-term care centers had numerous issues, but now this COVID it's really exposing the entire problems with this with these long-term care centers, because look at the deaths. Hundreds of people are dying because they're not being given proper protective equipment, the proper protocols are not being taken. And that's what I talked about 2 weeks ago when someone gave me two stories from two long-term care workers, and one of them being a pregnant woman who was forced to go into a room with someone who had COVID and wasn't told it. Like, I was literally told that by someone. And then, of course, now we're seeing mass, widespread systemic problems in these areas. And then I saw that the government said, okay, we're going to ban people from working at multiple long-term health care centers. But that's not, first off, that should have been done before. But this is the problem, is there's no solution to this. That's a Band-Aid solution. The solution to this is fixing these centers, making sure they're not understaffed, raising the standards, making sure they're inspected, and making sure the people inside of them have a decent standard of living. And this is kind of what this whole COVID thing has been a tragedy, but there is hope, I think, that after this we might start addressing some of the problems, right? I'm hoping that once this is all over, we're going to start funding healthcare properly. Because as of right now, there's problems that are being exposed that, Canada's response overall has been okay. It's actually been pretty good compared to other countries worldwide. But at the same time, I'd rather see Canada be in the top 5. I think we're in the top 20. I'd want to see Canada be in the top 5 for dealing with this, because, we're a rich country. We've got a lot of money. There's no excuse. It's 2020, right? We've sent people to the moon. We're talking about sending people to Mars. We've discovered complex things like nuclear energy and how to harness it. Why the fuck can we not get people masks to work at hospitals and long-term care centers? It doesn't make sense. It's such a stupid problem that is so easily fixable, but we're not addressing it. Why do grocery store workers not have masks right now? It doesn't make sense that our society that can be so advanced with technology, and in the past 100 years, when you look at the rapid rate in which we've created things like computers, the internet, as a species, we've made so much. But when it comes to something like this, I've been looking at past pandemics and we're dealing with it better, but we're dealing with it the same way we dealt with things like the flu pandemic 100 years ago. Social distancing, that's all we have right now, right? We don't have a vaccine. We don't have antivirals that are effective. We're essentially dealing with this the same way we dealt with it 100 years ago. And the pattern of social distancing, that can be traced back to the Black Death, the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, with the people with those really long, the doctors with the plague doctors with the long beak kind of looking mask. Social distancing was actually started before then, but it was effectively used in different parts of Italy and kind of what is nowadays England. That's this is a really old strategy, and to me it's really frustrating that we haven't dealt with this better, because it could have been a lot worse, and I'll get into that with Canada later, but I still don't think that we're at a spot where we can feel comfortable and we can feel that okay, this is under control, because we still don't have the personal protective equipment to deal with the long-term problem that's going to be with us probably for 2 years. Now that being said, I'll just quickly get into Ontario's projections. Worst case scenario, I saw that Ontario could have been projected to have 300,000 cases and 6,000 deaths by the end of April. And then a better situation would be 80,000 cases and 1,600 deaths by the end of April, which is really kind of scary, because that end of April is not that far away. And then overall, we've estimated that between 3,000 and 15,000 people will die throughout this entire pandemic of COVID. And if no action was taken, in Ontario alone, we could have had over 100,000 deaths, which is more deaths than World War I, which was, I think, killed around 60,000 people, and which is more deaths than World War II, which killed around, I think, 40,000 Canadians. I should say, not people in general, Canadians. That's really alarming, right? That if we didn't take the action we did, this could have killed more people than world wars. It could have killed more Canadians than Canadian soldiers died in world wars. That's really shocking. And when I also looked at this, left unchecked worldwide, this had the potential to be very close to how many people died from the flu pandemic 100 years ago. But also in Canada, if left unchecked, I'll get into this later, it could have actually killed more. COVID could have actually killed more people than the flu did 100 years ago if we didn't take measures to contain it. So next, I'll talk quickly about Quebec. Once again, I really like Quebec's website. It's funny, it's very French, even though there's the English version. When you read the French version, the way they word things is very French. It's situation of the COVID situation in Quebec. It just kind of made me chuckle. But currently, Quebec has the most confirmed cases in Canada. They have a population of 8.5 million people, which means that when you adjust for population, Quebec is experiencing a much larger outbreak so far than Ontario. Montreal is the epicenter of the outbreak, along with certain other cities like Laval and jurisdictions. Quebec is experiencing what seems to be a worse experience and outbreak in long-term care centers than Ontario so far. And that's mainly because they have a chronic shortage of healthcare staff in these centers. And also, the premier even said himself that he should have addressed this before. He should have raised people's wages, and he should have found more workers to begin with before all this started. Now, Quebec, in terms of testing, is doing more testing than Ontario, less than Alberta. It's important to keep in mind with Ontario that since our testing is actually not doing very well, last time I checked, as of yesterday, we still have 5,000 tests backlog. That number's fluctuated between 10,000 and 4,000. But Ontario does have a backlog of tests, so Ontario's numbers are delayed compared to other provinces right now. We have a larger delay. And also Ontario is doing less tests overall. And when you do less tests overall, you have less confirmed cases. So it's safe to say that Ontario has more cases than what we're reporting right now. But from my estimates, I don't think we have as many as Quebec. It's hard to tell because you're dealing with uncharted waters there. But Quebec projected, I think, on the optimistic side, 1,200 deaths by the end of April and 8,800 deaths by the end of April, which it seems like they're doing okay. But overall, we're seeing the main trend we're seeing in Canada is that we're seeing optimistic numbers with the public, and we're seeing very bad numbers with long-term care centers. I saw that Michaëlle Jean, the former Governor General of Canada, her aunt died in a long-term care center. And the problem with that is why it's important, because a lot of people think, oh, it's just old people, who cares? Well, I care. I think everyone's lives are valued. Just because someone's old, I don't think they deserve to die. But what's really sad is these people are dying in these long-term care centers, and they're never seeing their family again. They can't see their family. A lot of them don't have access to cell phones and ways to communicate. So a lot of these people are just dying without ever seeing their family again. And if you have a family member that dies in these centers, you can't have a funeral. You can't see their body at the funeral, which a lot of people in Ontario and Quebec too, especially Christians and other religions, people usually have an open casket funeral, and you're not having that. A lot of these people are just being cremated, and their families will never see them again, and that's really it's really sad, and it's really unfortunate that this is happening, and it was a preventable problem. Canada, before this all happened, there were numerous academic studies talking about the problems in Ontario, Quebec, all over Canada are long-term care centers, but we just ignored it. The money kept piling in, and now it's really bad. And when we're talking about this stuff, we have to keep in mind too that, COVID is not a accident. It's not a workplace accident. It's not, it's not a tragedy. It's a preventable death. Every single case of COVID is preventable if people are given the proper equipment to stop it from happening. And when I see people dying at their workplaces, grocery store workers dying for $14 an hour, oh, they got a bonus for $2, they're making $16 an hour, that doesn't fucking matter. These people are dying for these shitty jobs that are essential, and there's no compensation. These workplaces they're not being sued for negligence. They're forcing people to work in unsafe conditions that are resulting in the deaths of people, and we're not treating this properly. I saw a healthcare worker died the other day after 30 years of taking care of patients, and that just fucking sucks. That's so preventable. Give someone proper equipment to treat patients and they won't die. And so far we've failed. The deaths have been somewhat optimistic to some of the projections, but at the same time, any deaths are bad. And Canada could have done better. We've done better than a lot of countries, but I think there's a higher standard for us. We're a rich country. We're supposed to, people always talk about our healthcare. Canada is not the best country to live in the world, but in terms of economics, but the amount of money that people make and stuff like that's more so countries like Sweden and Norway. People have higher standards of living than we do here. But at the same time, I find it very disappointing that our structural problems in Canada have contributed to a higher amount of deaths and hospitalizations than we could have prevented. And I think there's still room to grow. I've like I said, certain provinces have handled it all right. They've handled it okay. I kind of give, like, if I were to give a mark, I would kind of say it's like Canada and certain provinces are kind of like a B or a C. When it comes to long-term care centers, that's more so like a D or lower. But overall, I would rather see Canada be at kind of like an A. No one's perfect. It's practically impossible to stop any deaths. But when you look at a country like South Korea handled the situation better than us. New Zealand so far, Australia, those countries have kind of... Now, it's hard to compare because of the amount of people who go in and out of those countries. But at the same time, I think there's room to grow in Canada. And I think there's room to take what we learned from this and make sure it doesn't happen to this extent again. Because 100% there will be another infectious disease. These things don't go away. This isn't a once in 1,000-year problem. 100 years ago, there was an extremely fatal influenza epidemic. Since then, we've seen outbreaks of H1N1, which is actually what that flu outbreak in 1918 actually was, a form of H1N1. But since then, we've seen SARS, MERS, which is like another version of this. SARS and MERS are more deadly than COVID-19. But it's inevitable that this will happen again. And it's very important that we learn from our mistakes and make sure our infrastructure is permanently fixed to deal with problems like this in the future. Now, overall, Canada as a country, I'm pretty critical of the way Trudeau has handled this, especially with regard to economics. I don't think he's done enough to help the average everyday people. As usual, what we've seen, this is why I talk about neoliberalism so much, is, we seem to think that there's left wings and there's right wings people. And, we seem to kind of make it more extreme than it really is. But the truth is that the Conservatives and the Liberals, even the NDP, even the Greens, all kind of work under this one framework, which is under neoliberalism. And even though the NDP, the Green Party, kind of tries to challenge that, at the end of the day, they still kind of work within that larger framework. They work on it in a modified way, but the NDP isn't, they're not, people try to say, they're a communist party, they're a socialist party. No, the NDP is not communist or socialist. Just ask someone who's actually a communist or socialist. They're not. They still work under the similar frameworks of other places, and that's where I find it disappointing with Canada as a whole. Is I was really hoping Justin Trudeau would do more to help everyday people and small businesses rather than large corporations. And this is what we've seen. It goes back to even Harper with the 2008 financial crisis. You saw Harper bail out the big auto companies, the big banks. And what was unfortunate about that is, even under conservative economic theory, that doesn't make sense, right? If you talk to a conservative, most conservative people typically tend to lean more so libertarian. They do not want government interference in the market. They believe in free markets, which is called liberalism, but I'll get into that in the future because I want to do a whole episode on liberalism to explain the different ways that word is used because it can be very confusing. But the problem is under conservative theory, Harper giving bailouts to the auto industry, that goes against conservative theory because you're using taxpayer money to fund these large corporations. And Canada gave billions of dollars to GM. What did GM do? They said, we're going to fuck off and go build cars in Mexico instead of Canada now. I used to work at a car factory, and it was the same thing. They keep shipping the jobs out to Mexico, and all the jobs they keep here rely on taxpayer dollars to subsidize them. It's bullshit. But this is what's important. This is why I say that rejecting this binary that, someone's liberal, someone's conservative, left wing, right wing, that stuff doesn't really exist. Politics is much more complicated, right? When you look at the political spectrum, some people try and say, okay, on the left side you have left-wing people, on the right side you have right-wing people. And at the top, it's kind of like a like a square divided into 4 sections. At the top, you have more authoritarian, big government, and then at the bottom you have libertarian. They kind of divide it into a 4-way scale. Well, even that is problematic because politics is much more complicated, and you need a more nuanced discussion. You need a larger discussion that is more detailed instead of trying to break it down to, oh, I'm left wing, I'm right wing. Well, it doesn't matter. Harper gave big corporations bailouts. Trudeau gave big corporations bailouts. It doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's similar. It's a similar pattern. And people who are further to the right wing reject that, and people who are further to the left wing reject that, right? Social Democrats, even further, obviously socialist communists reject that, but Social Democrats, even center-left people, they reject that. And that's what I find frustrating about this, is I was really hoping that the federal government, who's talked about universal basic income, that goes back to Pierre Trudeau back in the 70s. I was really hoping that the government would do more to help the everyday average person. And I'm not seeing that. Trudeau's CERB thing, it still leaves out a lot of people. It's really unfair to the essential workers because they're just expected to go to work and risk their lives for really shitty pay. I was really hoping that there would be more action taken, but it hasn't, gone that way so far, and I don't think it will. And I think it's really unfortunate because I think if we don't take advantage of this current situation, the future looks very bleak for working class people. The future looks very bleak for even lower middle class people, even middle class people. So those are just some of my thoughts on the way the federal government has dealt with this. Another example of this too, of why I talk about left-wing and right-wing stuff is, I think politics, if I were to do a master's, one of the things I'd probably talk about is how politics is cultural. And we seem to think the average person is, you have this political ideology and someone presents a situation to you and you react to it with that ideology. And that's not true, right? That's assuming that people are rational actors, and we're not. Humans are not rational actors. We're not computers, we're not robots. We have biases. And when presented with certain situations, those biases become known. And what's frustrating to me is that we get so caught up in being partisan or belonging to a certain ideology that we stop analyzing the situation properly. An example of this is right now, Trudeau gave Jason Kenney and people in Alberta, he gave the government $1.7 billion to clean up orphaned oil wells. Orphaned oil wells are oil wells that are used by corporations that went bankrupt, and they're just fucking left there. And it's dirty, it contaminates the soil, and they just sit there. So the federal government took $1.7 billion of taxpayer money and is going to clean up, is going to hire people, create jobs, but still using taxpayer money to clean up these oil wells that are the fault of these corporations who went bankrupt and didn't take the proper measures to clean them up. And that bothers me because taxpayer money shouldn't be going to that. But ironically, when it comes to people in Alberta who a lot of them hate Trudeau and wanted to separate a few months ago, a lot of them are okay with it. And what I don't understand about that is that fundamentally goes against conservative ideology. Using taxpayer money to clean up after corporations, it goes against conservative ideology, which it also goes against left-wing socialist, social democrat ideology as well. That's not taxpayers' mess to clean up. But because of the political culture of Alberta, since it has to deal with oil, people are okay with it. But if I were to propose a different situation, imagine if a bunch of windmills fell over and green energy stuff just collapsed, a bunch of solar panels collapsed. If the federal government spent $1.7 billion on cleaning up broken windmills that corporations left, a lot of these people would be extremely angry. But this is the point I'm getting to here, is that to understand politics in Canada, I think it's really important to incorporate the political culture rather than the whole left-wing, right-wing, spectrum and ideology stuff. Because a lot of times we go against our political ideology because of the culture surrounding a certain topic. We don't always react to it ourselves. We see how our peers, our friends, our leaders in politics react to a situation, and often, instead of doing what's logical, we side with people who are similar to us or who we see as similar. So fundamentally, that's what the problem is, I think, is in Canada, to get through this pandemic better, we have to give up those partisan, those ideological, kind of labels we give ourselves, because it's not true, right? Like, those people in Alberta, they should be very critical of using taxpayer money to clean up corporations' messes. That is a fundamental part of both conservatism and kind of social democrat left-wing stuff. But at the end of the day, a lot of people don't want to do that because we have emotional connection. Those people have an emotional connection with the oil industry, and it's a part of their culture. It's a part of their lifestyle. It's a part, almost not religious, but it's people in Alberta, oil is so important to them, to their culture and their daily life, that they'll go against patterns in their ideology to support something that they have an emotional attachment to. And I really think it pissed me off when I saw that, because I'm like, why are taxpayers paying for this? But it is what it is. And, people always portray Justin Trudeau as this anti-oil person, but Trudeau supports pipelines. Trudeau just gave $1.7 billion to clean up oil wells. When you look at politics in Canada, you have to take it issue by issue rather than labeling it as left-wing, right-wing, center, because our political parties do not always act in, what's the ideology they're supposed to represent. We see that happen all the time. That example I gave with Harper, it's the same thing, right? Any libertarian should go nuts at the idea of bailing out big corporations, because that's the fundamental, point of libertarianism in economics, is you're not supposed to have the government interfere and bail out companies. If companies fail, they're supposed to fail, and a new, more efficient company replaces them. That's a central part of, that kind of right-wing economic theory. But so often, back then, we saw people just say, okay, whatever, and not care about that. And I think that's a problem that I think everyone from all spectrums can really work on, is challenging this idea that certain parties will always do something, or certain politicians will do something. Political parties and people act irrationally all the time. They do stuff that doesn't make sense. And if you truly want to critically think about something, I think it's best to break it down and get rid of those influences and approach it from a critical perspective. And I think that's why, with COVID, it's so fundamentally important that people across Canada stop focusing on what their party's saying, Liberals, Conservatives, NDP, whatever, and people unite together to do what's best for everyone, and stop, because I see so many people fighting right now over their parties, over what the politicians are saying. And what really bugs me is there's so many people who are suffering right now. I think everyone should be pushing for some kind of form of universal basic income while this problem is happening. I think, and that goes for anyone. That could be conservatives, liberals, whatever. That would benefit everyone. That would benefit the economy. It would be temporary. It would really help a lot of people out right now, but it would also help the economy after this, because people are eating into their savings right now. Once this is all over, no one's going to be spending. We're looking at a looming recession that's probably going to be one of the worst in history. And I think that as Canadians, there's a lot of things people could do to work together better rather than getting caught in this partisan bullshit that we keep seeing. Because, there's just so many people suffering right now. And I think that when developing these strategies, instead of being at each other's necks over the different parties and stuff like that, I think it's much more efficient for people to just work on strategies and stuff they believe in. And that way we could really help out people who are in desperate need right now. Now, just getting back to Canada as a whole, I just wanted to bring up a couple facts I was looking at, that throughout this whole thing, if we took no measures, and there was no social distancing, there would have been over 350,000 Canadians who died. I think it could have actually been closer to 400,000. To put that into perspective, if we didn't address this at all, that's more than 3 times the amount of people in Canada who have died for wars ever since the country started. So we're looking at 3 times the amount of all the Canadian soldiers who died in both world wars and all other armed conflicts could have died if we didn't take the proper measures to solve this. And when I looked up that fact, because I compared it to the amount of soldiers who died, when I saw that, I thought that was pretty alarming. And I thought that was something that people should really know to put this into perspective, because so often it's so easy that to get caught up in opinions and fake news and stuff like that. People at the beginning saying, oh, this is just the flu. We could have seen more people die than all of our armed conflicts in Canadian history by a factor of 3. That just blew me away. Furthermore, I saw that 50,000 Canadians died from the flu pandemic in 1918, which it's really hard to say where we're going to be with this, because just like what happened in 1918, it was the second wave that killed more people. I was looking up some academic information about the way people handled the 1918 flu pandemic, and actually there was people back then saying, oh, I don't want to wear any masks, oh, I'm tired of staying at home. And that's one of the main things that caused the second wave, was that people didn't take it seriously. People got tired of the masks. Once we won the war, a lot of people gathered in huge groups to celebrate, and it was a very difficult time. But at the end of the day, I think that can serve as a lesson to us that we have to take this seriously, because this could kill just as many people. Now, overall, Canada's trajectory so far, like I said, has been okay. I went through each province, kind of broke it down. Certain provinces have bigger problems than other ones. The smaller provinces it's harder to talk about data and testing because the population is so small. You have to really adjust it. So I just compared the big 4 ones: Alberta, BC, Ontario, Quebec. Hopefully in the next coming weeks, we can see the pattern continue. The curve will continue to flatten in BC, most likely. In Alberta, hopefully in Ontario, we start to see it flatten, and hopefully in Ontario and Quebec, we take the proper measures to make sure that if we send everyone back to work immediately and don't take proper measures, it's the same thing over again. And, throughout this whole thing, I've done some research. The biggest thing I would do, honestly, my strategy, I would shut everything down except for essential. I don't mean like McDonald's, Tim Hortons, those places should be shut down. I would shut everything down, give everyone universal basic income and some sort of income to small businesses, stop rents and mortgages and stuff like that for a period of time until we had no new cases. And then I would wait, 2 weeks or whatever of no cases, and then gradually reopen things. Make sure the borders and everyone coming into the country, every single person has to go stay in a hotel, rather than, I wouldn't let them go back to their homes. Every single person has to go into a hotel or something at the border, quarantine for 14 weeks, and then come in. Then that way Canada could reopen, and we wouldn't have to have these multiple waves. Because the problem is, as long as there's new cases, it's still out there. And it's inevitable that you're going to have another wave. If you open things too early, you will have a second wave that will cause shutdowns again, most likely. And my strategy, I would handle it differently, is I would try to eliminate it just like we eliminated SARS. And then I would, to reboost the economy, what I would do is I would turn a lot of Canada and our manufacturing sector to be a worldwide global producer of healthcare products. So I wouldn't just make ventilators for Canada, I would make ventilators for other countries, masks for other countries. There's a huge global demand that if we were able to defeat the disease, because we have a good chance of doing that since we actually have done a decent job, we have a better chance of doing that than a place like the United States or Italy. Those countries are being destroyed by this disease. And if Canada could reopen and start manufacturing products across the world, we not only will we help the world, but we could boost our economy. We could give people jobs. There is hope in the future for this. I don't think that will happen. I think we're obviously going to open up earlier than expected, but I am hoping that we don't open up too early. I've seen some promising things from Doug Ford and Trudeau that we're not going to open up too early. Because if you open up, I understand people want to open things up for the economy, and that is a legitimate question. But opening up too early just means everything's going to get shut down again. And that's verified by science. So I think the most important thing is to listen to scientists and make kind of a middle point of understanding, okay, we have to keep in mind jobs and stuff like that, but also we have to keep in mind people's health. And that's going to be the long-term game here because, like I said before, this problem's not going to go away. This problem's going to be with us for up to 2 years. And we don't want to have to shut everything down every other month for 2 years. We want to deal with this effectively. That's why personally, I'd shut everything down until there's no new cases, reopen everything, and just absolutely have a booming recovery. And on top of that, giving people UBI would also create a huge economic boom once everything got back to normal. That's not going to happen because Canada's not, we're not going to do that. We're too centrist to do that. But hopefully we can figure out some kind of compromise there where we're not shutting down, because we opened too early. We're shutting down everything constantly. That's going to affect the economy even more. That's what I really try to influence here is this is a long-term game. And the economy is a long-term game too. It's not just, we open up the economy, everything's fine. If we open up too early, the cases spike again, you have to shut everything down again. And that's even worse for the economy, especially if you have to do that multiple times. I think that there's a proper way to deal with this, and that's listening to scientists and things like that. So I went through every province. It took me a long time to research that stuff because the public health, like a lot of their stuff changes pretty quickly. And so hopefully I gave you some information about the provinces, how they've handled it, what strategies I think will work. Overall, I know this is a very difficult time for people, but I think that there is reason to be somewhat optimistic, and there is reason to really consider listening to each other and working together in order to choose the best strategy that is best for all of us. Now, future episodes, I do want to do an episode on neoliberalism and talk about like market economics and kind of like the neoliberal consensus. Not sure when I'll do that. I do also want to talk about two other subjects in the future. I want to talk about social media for political parties because I've done a lot of research on that in the past. I want to talk about capitalism and video games because that's another thing I find interesting. I'm currently working on a paper about money in American politics, specifically self-financed billionaires in primary elections, and specifically super PACs with regard to Mike Bloomberg and what he did. So I'll definitely do an episode about that with the research I did. I'll also continue to cover the COVID stuff. I'll probably continue to keep doing that for the next couple episodes because that's obviously just the biggest problem that's ongoing, and that's the biggest topic to talk about right now. And once things get back relatively to normal, I'll probably adjust content. But like I said, it's going to be a while before things get back to relative normalcy, right? Like when we look at South Korea, when we look at some other countries, they're not even fully back to normal yet. So we're talking about months before our lives get back to normal. And the other issue is that we've had so many infections already. The longer South Korea had a much shorter peak, right? They nailed it a long time ago. They figured things out and flattened the curve a long time ago. They're still dealing with it now. Chances are it's going to take us a longer time because we have more cases, more people infected. The more cases you have, the longer you keep dealing with cases in the future. Just because then that's just how this disease works and how it spreads. Italy is still reporting thousands of new cases every day. it's been brutal there. So thanks for listening. I did my best to find some interesting information and really try to quantify what happened. The issue is you hear all these numbers about people dying and what's happening. It's hard to put that into perspective, and that's why I tried to put it into perspective by comparing it to the amount of soldiers Canada lost, because that's something a lot of us know about. We all took history in school, and we have some idea of what happened in World War I and World War II. So I'll let our Prime Minister take us out here with his Moist song, and I'll be back with another episode in a week or two. Take care.
If people want to wear a mask, that is okay. It protects others more than it protects you, because it prevents you from breathing or speaking moistly on them. Oh, what a terrible image. Moistly. Moist. Oh, what a terrible image. Moistly. Moist. Oh, what a terrible image.